Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 24. Monarchy and Mushrooms. As the 166th year of the Common Reckoning wound to its wintry close, Bina was becoming increasingly unhappy. Being captured at the Battle of Halgi's Hill had been embarrassing, but he had managed to make the best of it. He had given Halgi his word that he would not try to escape, and in return he had been granted a fair degree of freedom to wander around Bensby. Bina took full advantage of this. He liked to eat and drink, and enjoyed the company of others, particularly attractive females, and to start with, his fame and status meant that there was no shortage of people willing to indulge him in these tastes. But over time the novelty wore off, and people became less interested in him. And then the economic sanctions that Ingildrifa had imposed on Bensby really started to bite, and the population became increasingly hostile. Bina was reduced to lurking around Halgi's hall, keeping his head down and trying his best to be ignored. This behaviour was in no way suited to his temperament. And then, in the spring of the 167th year of the Common Reckoning, things got still worse for Bina. Halgi was running out of money and options, and decided to make one last throw of the dice, to march on Drown Daisy Ford in an attempt to capture the crossing and once again make himself master of the trade passing over the Silver Stream. Halgi had very few cards left to him, and Bina was by far the best of those cards. Halgi was not going to march off to war and leave his best card behind him in Bensby. No, Bina would accompany the army, and it would not do to have him freely wandering around the Geitsmark, where he might be recaptured. He would have to be restrained. Thus it was that Bina found himself bound hand and foot and thrown into the back of an ox-drawn wagon, while a number of the more unscrupulous of Halgi's followers were tasked with standing guard over him and making sure that he behaved himself. Halgi's march along the south bank of the Silver Stream toward Drown Daisy Ford did not go smoothly. Ingildrifa had stationed Magno Flagonfist and his remaining halfling mercenaries to cover this road, and they waged relentless guerrilla warfare against Halgi's army, attacking foraging parties and otherwise making a nuisance of themselves, slowing the army's progress. In one such skirmish, Egil, one of Halgi's younger brothers, was killed. This did not improve Halgi's mood. Ingildrifa had spent the winter rebuilding what strength she could. Her army was not large, but it was larger than Halgi's. She had weakened her enemy, and, reluctant as she was to take the risk of fighting another battle, she understood that this was her best chance to destroy her foe. So it was that, on the road to Drown Daisy Ford, Halgi found Ingildrifa waiting for him. Thus was fought the fight known afterwards as the Battle of the Wagon. It was a brutal and close-run contest. Ingildrifa saw her personal retinue of spear dwarves shattered and was forced to conceal herself in a thicket in order to save her skin. But Skopti led the mine guards of Silvermere and the Dark Hills to her aid, and, at the end of the day, it was Halgi who was wounded and captured. Ingildrifa traded Bina's life for Halgi's, but she did not allow Halgi to keep his throne. He abdicated and went into exile, accompanied by his family and close retainers. This victory confirmed Ingildrifa's position as the most powerful dwarf in Halfland. No longer only the Lady of Unnerscrag, she was now crowned as the Queen of the Geitsmark. Through her grandsons, she controlled the mines of Silvermere and the Dark Hills. Through gold and spear dwarves, she controlled the council of guildsmen, and through her friendship with Scalfin, she had significant influence over the dwarves of the Eastland. Indeed, Ingildrifa's power had spread so wide that, as Helgi had previously predicted, she was now mistress of all the old dwarvish lands. To find somewhere that was free of her influence, Helgi moved to the far frontier, beyond the Eastland and the Great River, and here, in a remote valley in the foothills of the northern mountains, he founded the settlement of Utdal. The settlement thrived. There was ore in the hills, and the valley was fertile. Helgi's physical wounds healed, although ever after he walked with a limp. But he no longer found any joy in life, preferring to brood on his misfortune, and this may have shortened his days. In the 174th year of the Common Reckoning, he died, and his son, Halnor, assumed the leadership of his people. In the 168th year of the Common Reckoning, a great plague afflicted the goblins of Halfland. Many perished. It was around this time that the goblins first came into contact with the elves, who some 15 years previously had settled in the foothills of the Wolf Rock Mountains, at the eastern end of the Goblin Downs. The elven settlers had enjoyed themselves immensely, wandering around in the virgin woodlands of their new home. Although they had a particular love of trees, they took pleasure in all the flora and fauna of the forest. They found especial joy when they came across a variety or species that they had not previously encountered, and one such thing that they found was the scarlet spangenhelm mushroom. These visually striking red conical fungi only grew in a very few forest clearings on the southern slopes of the Wolf Rock Mountains, and were thus new to the elves. They were not particularly nutritious, but if they were dried and ground up, and then infused in hot water, the result was a drink that the elves found pleasant tasting and refreshing. Goblins are always curious and like to experiment and try new things. So when they met the elves, it was not long before they sampled this beverage. But the physiology of goblins differs from that of elves. When imbibed by goblins, the effect of infused dried scarlet spangenhelm mushrooms was not mildly restorative. It was instead extremely hallucinogenic. The goblins named the beverage sorcerer's tea, and they could not get enough of it. The elves were more than happy to sell desiccated ground-up mushrooms to the goblins. They could have cleared patches of forest and attempted to farm the mushrooms, but they did not want to fell trees for this purpose. They therefore limited themselves to foraging for scarlet spangenhelms in the wild. This meant that the supply was always limited, and the price was correspondingly high. The elves therefore did reasonably well out of the trade. The goblins did not. The plague had done extensive damage both to the goblin economy and to the society that it supported, and, rather than working to repair this damage, many goblins were now squandering what little wealth still remained to them on sorcerer's tea, and spending their time comatose, staring into space, losing themselves in unreal visions. There was a goblin named Arpnik who described himself as a merchant. His business involved travelling into the elven lands, purchasing as much sorcerer's tea as he could get his hands on, and selling it to stupefied goblins at prices higher than they could afford. He made a lot of money, but he reasoned that he could make even more if he could produce the drug himself. The elves were keen to keep the monopoly on the production of sorcerer's tea. They were therefore unwilling to talk in detail about what it was made from and how those ingredients were processed. But Arpnik asked questions and kept his eyes and ears open, and he pieced most of the picture together from the various fragments of information he was able to glean. Arpnik knew nothing about mushrooms, but there were goblins who did. Many goblins foraged for mushrooms, and some even cultivated them. Arpnik spoke to these people. He learned that mushrooms sprouted from a web of filaments underground, and that if he wished to grow mushrooms, that was where he should start. He needed to find a colony of the relevant mushrooms and dig. But he had two problems. He knew sorcerer's tea was made out of mushrooms, but he did not know exactly which mushrooms, and he did not know where to find them. But the elves knew, and if they did not want to tell him, well, there were ways of changing that. There was an elf named Nimerath, from whom Arpnik habitually purchased sorcerer's tea. Arpnik offered to pay Nimerath much gold in exchange for a description of the scarlet Spangenhelm mushroom, how to identify it, and where it grew. Nimerath refused, so Arpnik and two of his more muscular assistants took Nimerath into the forest and beat the relevant information out of him, and then they killed him. Arpnik wasted no time. Later that afternoon he was in a woodland clearing working with a shovel, and by the time night fell he was well on his way home, making all possible haste. But not haste enough. Nimerath's corpse had been found by his friends. They knew he was meeting Arpnik. The business relationship between them was no secret. Goblins are not renowned for their stealth, and it was easy enough for the elves to follow the goblin's trail. This led them to the clearing scarred by Arpnik's spade work, and Arpnik's motive now became clear. The elves did not want Nimerath's murder to pass unavenged. Neither did they wish to lose their monopoly on scarlet Spangenhelm mushrooms. They continued their pursuit of Arpnik, travelling as fast as they could. When it comes to travelling through woodland, an elf will always outpace a goblin, and these elves were on home ground. They caught up with the goblins at Stepstone Ford. There was a sharp skirmish, in which 2 elves and 1 goblin were killed, but the goblins managed to cross the ford and get away. The elves were most unhappy with Arpnik's antics. Shortly after these events, a goblin named Vadvik travelled to the elven wood and tried to trade with the elves, as he had done many times before. A gang of elves jumped him, gave him an extremely thorough beating, and sent him back to the Goblin Downs with a message that goblins were no longer welcome in the lands of the elves, and a warning that any future visitors would not be beaten, but simply hung by the neck from the nearest tree until they were dead. This all suited Arpnik just fine. On his return to the Goblin Downs, he had established a mushroom farm, and he was soon producing large quantities of sorcerer's tea. He had intended to undercut the elves and corner the market, but the trade embargo imposed by the elves had gifted him a monopoly. Now he did not need to undercut anybody. Instead, he put his prices up and rapidly became extremely wealthy. To the extent that they even thought about it, the goblins assumed that beating up a goblin merchant and closing the border was sufficient to counterbalance the crimes of Arpnik. They therefore expected that elven anger would now subside, and friendly relations between the elves and the goblins would soon be restored. They were wrong. The elves were only getting started. This became apparent when an elven army marched into the Goblin Downs and started looting and burning goblin farms. Now, having orcs as neighbours had accustomed goblin farmers to being violently ransacked from time to time. They had tried and tested methods for dealing with this situation and used them. They packed up their valuables and moved somewhere that the pillagers were not, until the danger had passed. These tactics significantly reduced the number of encounters between elves and goblins, but encounters still occurred. Some goblins tried to defend their property. Others were too stupefied with sorcerer's tea to understand that the elves were coming, and so did not even attempt evasive action. When encounters did occur, the goblins discovered that, at least compared to the orcs, the elves were positively gentle. The elves were not waging a war of extermination. While they would cheerfully slaughter any goblins who chose to fight, in general they were more interested in plunder and information than in killing for killing's sake. Several goblins encountered elves and escaped with their lives, if not their possessions. And all of those goblins were questioned as to the whereabouts of Arpnik. Goblins are intelligent. If the elves were looking for Arpnik, maybe, if they found him, they would go home and leave everyone else in peace. A few goblins sought to turn the situation to their own advantage, attempting to sell information regarding Arpnik's whereabouts to the elves. But the elves treated them with contempt. Why pay for information that many other goblins were prepared to provide for free, if pressed at sword point? Arpnik soon understood that an army of vengeful elves was heading rapidly toward him. The question was, what should he do about it? He could run, but to where? It did not seem to him that he could find safety from the elves anywhere in the Goblin Downs. Leaving the Goblin Downs, he could either head into the Elven Forest, which did not seem desirable, or into the Orcan lands, which seemed worse. So running was not an option. He either had to fight the elves or come to some sort of arrangement with them. His preference was to negotiate. He sent several envoys to the elves, trying to start a dialogue. None of his envoys returned. It seemed that his only option was to fight. But he could not fight an army of elves alone. He needed to raise an army of his own. It rapidly became very clear that the goblins were not going to rally round his banner in order to defend their homeland. They would rather end the war by handing him over to the elves. If he wanted them to fight for him, he would have to pay them to do so. Arpnik had plenty of gold, but he understood goblins too well to think that he could buy their loyalty. They would take his money, of course, and promise to fight, but that meant very little when they could avoid risking their lives in battle by taking him prisoner and handing him over to the elves. However, there was one group of goblins who he could rely on. His recent activities meant that there were large numbers of goblins who would do anything in order to satisfy their cravings for sorcerer's tea. He could supply that commodity to them. And there was no other source. If the elves killed him, then no goblin would ever be able to drink sorcerer's tea ever again. This argument proved very persuasive. Arpnik soon recruited an army of spaced-out sorcerer's tea drinkers, whose loyalty to him was unshakable as long as he provided them with their daily infusion of dried scarlet spangenhelm mushrooms. And, having made his preparations, he sat and waited patiently for the elves to arrive.